Our next speaker is Ingo Schmidt. And Ingo is the academic coordinator of the Labor Studies program at Athabasca University in Canada. His research focuses mainly on international political economy and labor movements. He's written two of his recent books published by Pluto are Reading Capital Today in 2017 and Three Worlds of Social Democracy in 2015. And he also wrote Rosa Luxemburg's Accumulation of Capital, which was published by VSA Verlag in 2013. So Ingo, please go ahead.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Radhika. Hello, everybody. I will actually focus quite a bit on energy prices, ecology, and geopolitics. And to do that, I will start with giving some stylized facts. And I understand after Marika's talk, that is quite a challenging thing to do, given the variety of inflation and other economic developments across countries. I should say that my stylized facts refer to the first world, to Western countries, even though energy prices are obviously world market prices. Then I will focus on the interpretation of what I consider a key part of the return of inflation, which is energy prices, geopolitics, and the challenge and problems of moving away from fossil capitalism. And I will end with a very brief and very bleak outlook, but I do hope by doing so I will get some more optimistic, positive pushback in the discussion in terms of what we can do moving forward, dealing with some of the problems that we are facing. And like Chandru said, I can only reiterate that inflation is a symptom of something much larger and actually much more problematic than inflation could ever be. So my stylized facts, is there a demand pull inflation in the Western countries? No, I don't think so. There was talk about it after the first wave of the pandemic, after the first lockdown was over, but since then the boom has been delayed and delayed and delayed. And even without rising interest rates, most economic forecasters are warning that we are probably in for a recession rather than for a demand boom, and therefore there's also no demand pull inflation. The next popular thing that's always coming up, and Marika talked about it quite a bit already, is wages. If you just look at wages, yes, nominal wages are rising in most countries, but only a little bit after the Great Recession, not by very much. And if you look at wages and prices to calculate real wages and wage shares and profit shares, you very quickly get the picture that what we're having right now is a profit inflation. Profit margins are increasing drastically. There's enormous crisis profiteering going on at this point. I will come back to that in a moment, just to kind of cancel out the last most among the popular explanations of why there might be inflation. It's of course money supply. Some people may remember the monetarists, Milton Friedman. That is not a good explanation at all, because since 2008, since the Great Recession, there was basically free money, at least for people who didn't have difficulty having money in the first place. There were unlimited supplies of money, and there was not much inflation since then. But there was a return very briefly after the Great Recession of the commodity boom that actually started very early in the 2000s. If there was general inflation after the Great Recession, it was almost entirely triggered by the resurgence of the commodity boom. And what is notable currently after the Corona and the war in Ukraine events started to unfold is that there's a much stronger spillover from energy prices to general inflation. And this, I think, has to do largely by crisis profiteering, jumping to chances to jack up profit margins in a way that we haven't seen in a very long time. But as I said, I will mainly focus on commodity prices. energy prices, most particular. Obviously, energy prices are related to food prices, and I should also say there is almost uninterrupted, despite the housing crisis in the United States in 2007. If you look like at 20, 30-year-long developments, it has always almost become invisible house price. And if house prices were properly reflected in inflation data, inflation would have been much higher for a very long time. What is noticeable is that the main drivers of inflation, houses, food, and energy, are all related to ground rent. And there's also a connection to finance, into which I will not go. I assume Michael Hudson will speak about that. But it's all, finance is clearly kind of driving the inflation in everything having to do with ground rent. And industrial capital, which should be the big profiteer of cheap supplies of labor thanks to global neoliberal globalization, has to share some of its profits with finance and the owners of land, because we have these developments of commodity prices. Now, I already mentioned the commodity boom. Some called it a super cycle, started in the early 2000s. What also started in the early 2000s, I mentioned geopolitics, was the war on terror. It seems to me quite clear there's a link between the war and terror and the commodity super cycle, which, just to reiterate, the Great Recession of 2008 only interrupted it, but it came back with a vengeance very shortly thereafter. And the commodity cycle ended in 2014. Now, what's the story behind that? The United States, ever since OPEC, were very nervous about losing control of becoming dependent on energy imports from other countries and losing control over global energy supplies, because next to finance, food and military power, it's a convenient tool to display imperial power over the world. The problem of the United States, of course, is its own supplies of energy are largely what is usually called non-conventional forms, like the shale gas boom. They are only profitable if energy prices are sufficiently high. In other words, the United States needed high oil prices, regardless of all the talk that prices should be low. Generally, energy prices were exempt, just like housing. They needed to be high in order to bring the US back into the big player game of energy exports, and they did. Just there's a problem with that. High energy prices also benefit those countries who sit on supplies that are easier to access, i.e. where production costs are much lower, therefore profits are higher. And as it turns out, those are mostly countries that are considered as unfriendly enemy countries or whatever. Some of them have been bombed, Iraq and Libya. Others have been sanctioned, like Venezuela, Iran, and most recently Russia. So the geopolitical problem here is quite obviously that the United States relies on high energy prices that benefit the very countries that it considers as enemies. And the way of dealing with this through sanctions and war leads to a further strain on the, let's say, on the American empire, which under that pressure is falling apart more and more. It's more difficult to sustain because the very means applied to sustain an American empire are the very same reasons as war and sanctions that are making sure that it is falling apart. This, by the way, is not only true, it's not my topic today, but clearly something to keep in mind. It's not only true with as far as sanctions in the energy sector go. I just like to remind people of the trade war with China, and there are other cases that are important, or the weaponization of the US dollar, of course, the seizing of central bank or foreign reserves by the West. Whatever other governments might think of Vladimir Putin, it's clearly a signal that the holy grail of neoliberal economics, that private property is untouchable. It doesn't apply to the preachers of neoliberalism if that's not a major strain on global neoliberalism spearheaded by the United States. I don't know what could be. And I also said I would talk about ecology. The major victim of this current wave of energy-related inflation and geopolitical conflict, the major victim is nature, which of course is if there's an overarching problem in the world, it's ecological devastation. And the whole war and sanction regime does nothing to contribute, despite all the green talk and everybody's buying Teslas now, thereby insinuating that nothing has to change other than you get an electric car instead of having a fossil fuel powered car. The whole discussion about having ecologically sustainable ways of production and life kind of has been destroyed by the current war and sanction regime. And this leads me to my, I promised to get a bleak outlook, and here it is. Obviously, the first part of the bleak outlook and probably the most devastating is the ecological outlook. And let's be clear, war is kind of an accelerated way of ecological and social destruction. But on top of that, interestingly enough, Radhika mentioned that in her introduction, that it's basically impossible to raise interest rates because it destroys the financial center, which was key for moving capitalism and imperialism forward for over 30, 40 years. But it seems more and more there is, despite being dependent on cheap money and asset inflation, more and more there seems to be in capitalist elite circles a consensus that we will do it anyways. And it will be a special, I'm wrapping up. It will be actually austerity Ronald Reagan kind. Like during the days of Ronald Reagan, they're gearing up for austerity for those who want some butter. There will be no enormous cuts to the butter. But at the same time, they are not only fighting inflation through interest rate hikes, they're also preparing to pump more and more money into the arms industry. We're already seeing that most governments seem to be so grateful that there is a war in Ukraine. It's a perfect excuse to produce more and more weapons. But I don't see how the rest of the Reagan story, which kicked off neoliberal globalization, could be replayed, because neoliberal globalization is coming apart at its seams, as I said, due to sanctions and war. And I really wish people can come up with some positive pushback to my bleak outlook. So that was my little spiel. Thank you very much for your attention.
I'm Michael Hudson. I'm appearing here for the International Manifesto Group. If you like this video and ones like it, please subscribe. For more information, go to the address on the screen.